This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, Starbucks bows to Farrakhan and Jew hatred. Backed by popular demand, Daniel Greenfield, Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the editor of the blog The Point at frontpagemag.com. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me back one more time. It came as a real surprise.
Thank you, Daniel. Very profound article at Front Page on Farrakhan and how Starbucks has bowed to his anti-Semitism and the other factors connected to it. It's also at The Point. Before we begin our serious discussion, the most serious, of course, question is any updates on the hat?
Well, I'm starting to think the hat is developing a mind of its own.
Right.
Sometimes I hang it up on the coat hook and it's not there when I come back, so you never know.
Well, we've noticed, and a lot of our viewers have noticed, that without the hat, you're still very intelligent, always intelligent, but when you're wearing the hat, just this genius brilliance takes over. Is there a pattern there, or people are just reading into things?
I'm actually not very bright. It's just the hat that's doing all the work.
Okay. Okay, Daniel, let's get to the serious issues of our time. Increasing, as we know, increasing Jew hatred and anti-Semitism worldwide. I mean, what's going on in France? You know, a lot of Jews are leaving France, as we know. The Muslim migrants are coming in, so anti-Semitism starting to skyrocket. And on our own territory, now Starbucks is surrendering to Jew hatred. Before we get to that, I wanted to take this evening to let our viewers get to know you a little bit better, because you have quite a fascinating background that has created such a fascinating person. But I want to tie in your own experience and your identity and your beliefs into also what Jewish identity and faith is, and tie it into why the Unholy Alliance is so anti-Semitic. So let's see if we can connect those dots a bit. Okay, Daniel?
That sounds interesting.
Okay, Daniel, let's begin. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, some readers know I was actually born in Israel. I was born in Jerusalem. But my father was in World War II. My grandfather was in World War I. And, you know, the usual thing that I say, if there's ever a World War III, there is a good chance I will be in it. My father was actually a little boy when the Nazis invaded Poland. Well, not that little at this point. He was already 11, 12, but he ended up having to flee. He found himself joining the partisans. My mother, quite a bit later, was a dissident in the Soviet Union, was a political dissident. She came to fight for Jewish rights, and she eventually managed to make it to Israel, where she met my father, who also made it to Israel.
Fascinating story. Now, and why will you be in World War III?
Well, because my grandfather was in World War I, my father was in World War II, so there's a bit of a pattern there.
Oh, okay. All right. Daniel, what is your faith?
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, and are you liberal? Are you conservative? How do you define yourself, and how do you practice your Jewish faith?
Well, I'm conservative politically, religiously. I'm part of what is known as Orthodox Judaism, which basically believes that the Bible, the Torah, comes directly from God, and that we are meant to actually follow the ways of God, while various more overall denominations have their own takes, but are less likely to believe in a divinely inspired truth. Okay,
and just, you know, just tell us one or two things in terms of, for instance, what happens on Friday evening to until Saturday evening in general for our viewers.
Well, on Friday evening begins the Sabbath, which is the commemoration of the time when God created the earth and then rested on the Sabbath. So to commemorate that, we also rest. We don't do any work. That's the period of time where, of course, as Jamie, you know, I'm very much offline and just incommunicado for that period of time. And it's a way to commemorate obviously the creation of the world, God's role in the world and in our lives on a constant basis. Because when we interrupt the week, when we interrupt the time that we have to work, that we have to go through our usual routine, we're reminded that ultimately everything that is possible, everything in the world comes from God.
Right, and it's a time also of showing respect to God in many things. And just may I ask, because I know several friends of mine, so can you just give us an example? There's certain forms like you don't send email and there's no use of electricity, etc. Could you just talk about that?
Sure. Well, just as a practical thing, we don't do work, which means we're not going to use electricity. It means I'm not online. It means I'm not on the phone. It means I'm not on the computer. It means that I may hear the news. For example, during the terrorist attack in Orlando, I heard the news, but I couldn't actually do anything about it. And there is a kind of comfort in that because, again, it reminds you ultimately that God runs the world. There are things we can do, but there's also a time to just let go and let God control things.
Daniel, how is that biblically based? It's connected to fire, I think, as well in the Old Testament, right?
That's quite correct. There are certain types of categories of labor, and this kind of thing gets complicated, but suffice it to say, electricity is also considered fire. You're sparking something. You're creating energy, or at least you're not creating energy, but you're bringing energy to life. You're making use of it.
Right, okay. Thank you, Daniel. Like, we definitely need probably 2 hours on each of these questions I'm going to ask, but just very quickly, and I apologize for approaching very profound, serious subjects, and only we have 30 seconds perhaps to discuss each one. But do you also believe in the existence of the soul and in the afterlife?
Absolutely. We come into this world. God breathed in the first soul into Adam, the first man, and he breathes it into each and every one of us. There's a part of us that comes from God and that returns to God when our time in this world is done.
And do you believe in heaven and hell?
Well, we believe in a kind of heaven and hell. This is an area that's a bit above my pay grade. We're not, within Judaism, we don't really think that much about the afterlife. We're told that our mission is to labor in this world for God, and that we're not meant to think of the reward necessarily, but to be faithful servants to God. Nonetheless, there is a kind of a heaven and a hell, and in a very general sense, because these are complicated concepts, we think of heaven as being closeness to God and hell as being distance from God.
Okay. Daniel, in terms of the stories of Adam and Eve, of the ark, etc., are those metaphorical to you, or do you believe those literally?
Well, as Orthodox Jews, we believe in the literal truth of the Bible, which means that we actually believe that all of this happened. It's not just a metaphor. There are aspects of it that are also metaphors that illustrate all sorts of ideas, but we also believe that these are literal truths.
Right. Daniel, let me ask you this. In terms of your identity, in terms of the faith that we've just very quickly touched on some elements, why are they so opposed to the leftist vision of the world? And why does the leftist viewpoint so much hate, really, the Judeo-Christian tradition and also Jewish people in Israel, etc.?
At the most basic level, the left is a secular religion. It worships God, it worships man rather than God. It's powered by the idea that we can actually take government, replace God with government, and then build an entire cult of personality, an entire religion around people, monsters really like Stalin or Hitler or Castro or Che, all the other ones, or Mao. And with that cult of personality, we can justify human sacrifices, the sacrifice of millions of people to show the power of government. It's anti-God at the most fundamental level, and it invariably comes after the Jews. Because if you're building an ideology that is hostile to God, that is opposed to the very idea of God, of spirituality in the world, then you have to crush the very people who, introduced it to the world. If you believe that there is nothing in this world but material reality, that there's nothing meaningful but force and power, then the best way to demonstrate that is to, again, destroy the Jews.
Right, and some scholars have written on this. I remember I was fascinated as a kid reading this, that Jews are also hated very much by many in the world, but the left especially, because they created conscience.
Yes, that's the fundamental reality of it. Because conscience comes from the recognition that there is a higher moral authority, that there is something outside ourselves. And if there's nothing outside ourselves, then conscience is meaningless. It's just how you are accountable to yourself. It's something like honor. But when you actually recognize that there is a God, then there is something higher than you for you to be accountable to. There is somebody who knows what you did and whom you can't lie to or deceive, and that is a very powerful idea.
And when you are a self-appointed social redeemer and you make yourself a God, then you hate the idea of God and of God's hierarchy.
Yes, there's no room for it at all, because the left creates salvation and damnation from within man. So man is destroying the world through global warming, through whatever they're calling it now, climate change. And then man can save the world by recycling. There's the whole drama of salvation and damnation, of redemption. You can transform the world, you can change the world. There is sin. Sin is going against anything that the left believes, against any of its social policies. And of course, there are the good deeds. There's redemption through social justice. And all this is meant to displace the actual religion and then the idea of God. So you have to destroy those things in order to make the ideology of the left completely triumphant in the world. And that's why every leftist regime is invariably militantly socialist, it's anti-religious, it persecutes religious people.
Daniel, how can a person that considers themselves a Jew possibly be a leftist? But there are so many leftist Jews.
Well, they can't. So when we talk about Jews, we're talking about two things. We're talking about a race, an ethnic group, and we're also talking about a religion. Now, there are, of course, plenty of people with Jewish last names, people who are ethnically, originally were Jewish, but that's largely meaningless. Jewish is an identity, and it's also a religious practice. It's something that you bring down from your parents and something you pass down to your children. If you're not part of this continuous chain, then you're not part of the Jewish people. You're just a person with a Jewish last name. Now, the process of leftist secularization has created a very weird reality where, for example, a majority of American Jews rate having a sense of humor as being more important to being Jewish than actually believing in religion or attending synagogue on any kind of regular basis. And, well, having a sense of humor is very nice. I like to think I have a bit of a sense of humor. But if you think that your identity and the identity of the Jewish people is defined by having a sense of humor, then you're kind of out to lunch.
And it could be legitimately said that leftist Jews ultimately are Jews that are trying to shed themselves of their own Judaism.
That's very much so. So there's a kind of historical basis for this. Once the left took over, it provided opportunities to assimilate, to integrate into society in exchange for abandoning religion. In France, for example, this was a very explicit bargain. In the Soviet Union, it was far more explicit. Basically, for example, my grandfather was never able to get a higher education because his father had actually been what was considered a religious worker, which meant that in the Soviet term, he was one of the followers of a cult, which meant that he could never really have proper civil rights. So the Soviet Union did everything it could to stamp out Judaism, to stamp out the practice of religion, because the goal was to wipe it out. Now, the people that the Soviet Union was using to do this dirty work, at least initially, were known as the Yevsektia, or the Jewish section. So they would take these leftist Jews, and these people would very willingly, enthusiastically, they would shut down synagogues, they would inform on people, they would attack worshipers during services, they would attack rabbis, they would denounce people and make sure that they were sent to the gulag, that they were executed, because there was this kind of civil war between those Jews who actually believed in the religion and those who believed in the left, and the civil war is still going on today.
Right, because when the left creates its utopian paradise where everybody holds hands and is equal, the Jew that somewhere hates himself or is trying to shed himself of his Judaism, or maybe is so frightened by anti-Semitism, he doesn't have to be a Jew anymore, right? In that utopian paradise, right?
That's exactly so. And this is something that Lenin wrote about. It's something that H.G. Wells and others wrote about. Their sales pitch was that there are actually no Jews. They're just these people who were kind of singled out. They're a bit confused. They're going to integrate with the rest of society, and then Jewishness will vanish. And those who refuse to are reactionaries, and they're going to have to be cracked down on. And this was their general approach to religion.
Okay, and so we're trying to get this all done within 30 minutes. I think we're going to. So now, from these very profound themes, we switch over to Starbucks. But it's all going to come, we're going to connect these dots. So look, so we've got the Philadelphia Starbucks manager, you wrote about this the other day. You know, he calls the police after 2 black men refused to leave. Just give us the quick story of how this leads up to this new training program they created and then had to crack down on the Jewish element.
So as people probably know, there was a Starbucks manager. 2 black men came in. They asked to use the bathroom. They didn't buy anything. She told them that they couldn't do that and asked them to leave, and they refused to leave. The police were called. The police asked them to leave 3 times. They refused to leave. The police arrested them, then released them. The result were these loud vocal protests against Starbucks, accusing Starbucks of racism. It touched off a whole campaign that's now dragging in other companies, Waffle House, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Starbucks responded to this by beating their breasts and announcing there was going to be a tolerance training program. They brought in a number of organizations to do the tolerance training. There was the NAACP, there were a few others, and there was the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League. That's a left-wing organization which had Jewish origins, and increasingly it's just basically a leftist group. But the ADL had done one thing before this. The ADL has largely abandoned the battle against anti-Semitism on campus. It's organizations that, like the Freedom Center, like others, like Canary Mission, that are actually fighting this fight. But the ADL actually criticized a woman by the name of Tamika Mallory, who was one of the heads of the Women's March, because she had actually been at a Farrakhan rally. Farrakhan is the head of the Nation of Islam, a very racist and anti-Semitic organization, and she had been there and she had praised him, and he had been delivering this very vile anti-Semitic speech. Now, the ADL criticized her for doing this. So when Starbucks announced it was partnering with the ADL, then immediately she began attacking Starbucks for partnering with a, quote, anti-black organization. And now Starbucks has climaxed everything by breaking its tie with the ADL.
Right. So this is very interesting, though. But the ADL, this Anti-Defamation League, as you've said, they really aren't for Jewish rights, really. They've betrayed, in many respects, the Israeli and Jewish cause, correct?
Very much so. They're, again, they're becoming more and more of a left-wing group, but they have to do something just to sort of maintain their credibility with a certain portion of the community. So they will occasionally condemn some anti-Semitism on the left, and this was one of those cases where they decided, okay, come on, it's Farrakhan, it's the Nation of Islam, he's there talking about the satanic Jew. We can surely condemn this and nothing bad will happen to us, and the left is not going to get angry at us for doing this.
Right, but Farrakhan, and then the people supporting him that are also part of this Women's March, they pressured Tamika Mallory and the rest of that crowd. They pressured Starbucks to get rid of the ADL on that particular effort that they started, right?
Indeed, exactly.
And why in the end do you think Starbucks surrendered?
Because while Starbucks is very worried about being seen as racist, they're now worried about being seen as anti-Semitic. Now, there's an interesting precursor to this. Back in 2014, Starbucks issued this extensive news release explaining that at no point in time does it give money to Israel, does it support Israel, does it have any stores in Israel. And this was a very bizarre press release because companies don't normally do this. And you had, for example, CNN with the headline, Starbucks, we don't fund Israel, and similar news sources. Again, this is a very, very strange message, because imagine if McDonald's put out a news release saying, no, we don't give any money to black people. It would be pretty bizarre and would be considered racist. But Starbucks did it in response to Muslim claims that they were giving money to Israel. And I mean, this is a type of conspiracy theory that is pretty common in the Muslim Middle East. For example, you can go to memory and see these sheikhs and personalities on television in the Middle East saying that Pepsi stands for, I think, pay every penny to Israel or something like that. The point is, these conspiracy theories are commonplace. Companies don't normally get out there and put out press releases disavowing them, but Starbucks felt the need to disavow Israel, to disavow any connection to the Jews, and here they did it all over again.
Thank you, Daniel. Tell me a little bit about this individual, Tamika Mallory, national co-chair of the Women's March.
So there are three of these national co-chairs. Linda Sarsour is one, Tamika Mallory is another, and Carmen Perez is a third. And all of them have praised Louis Farrakhan at one time or another. Tamika Mallory is a younger African-American woman. Linda Sarsour, I think viewers know her pretty well. All of them were the co-chairs of the Women's March. They were organizing this and these anti-Trump protests that so many people on the left got behind. And then it turned out that the people who were running these organizations were perfectly fine with Farrakhan. Now, aside from being anti-Semitic, and Farrakhan is very anti-Semitic, he's also racist in general against white people, because the theology of the Nation of Islam, it's not really normal Islam. Instead, it claims that white people were created by a mad scientist, but in this kind of eugenics experiment. And of course, it also is not very fond of women. So they're supposed to be feminists. This is the Women's March. And at the very rally where Tamika Mallory was in attendance, Farrakhan was out there screaming that all these women are lazy, their husbands are getting fat because they're going out there and getting fast food because they're not cooking for them because they're so lazy. And this is pretty close to what the exact language that he was using. Now, this is pretty hilarious because, feminism is so militant, it's so examining the patriarchy. And here you've actually got the patriarchy on stage and they're cheering it on.
Just bizarre, but we know that...
I'm sorry, I forgot one more fun thing. It was the one where Farrakhan was claiming that Jews were using pot to make black men gay.
Okay. And what's the logical argument for that?
This is an insane cult that believes that UFOs are going to come down and blow up everybody around the year 6000, I think. So I wouldn't look for too much rationality. This is a crazy, racist, hate-filled cult.
Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Daniel, in terms of some of the things we talked about in the beginning, in terms of the Jewish people and their faith and their roots, why does Louis Farrakhan hate Jews so much?
Well, when you think about the Nation of Islam, this is a really bad ripoff of Islam, and Islam was already a really bad ripoff of Judaism and Christianity. So it was natural for Muhammad to hate Jews and Christians, and it's even more natural for Farrakhan to hate them because Muhammad was just a ripoff artist, and Farrakhan is a ripoff artist of a ripoff artist. He's got this really smeared, blotchy carbon copy. His religion is basically based on hate. There's absolutely nothing positive to it. There's a lot of talk about pride, but pride largely means hating everybody else. So it's absolutely natural for him to constantly rant about the satanic Jews, to believe that the Jews are the only thing blocking the Nation of Islam from becoming popular, because obviously everybody would otherwise flock to his crazy cult and want to become one of the fruits of Islam.
In terms of the left controlling the Women's March, or I would say the unholy alliance controlling the Women's March, because we've got the Linda Sarsour and her factions, Tamika Mallory, and Carmen Perez, as you say. But we've got a Women's March that's embracing a Jew hater. How do we integrate that? Is that some kind of death wish?
Well, it's not a death wish for them because they're not Jewish. It is classical anti-Semitism, but again, it's fairly typical that the further you go to the left, the more anti-Semitic it becomes. We've discussed some of the reasons.
But just a sec. A death wish in the sense that, like we were saying, I mean, women are not going to fare too well under the universe that Farrakhan creates.
But maybe this is exactly what they want. Maybe this is what Linda Sarsour wants. Maybe this is what Tamika Mallory wants. The left says that people should believe certain things, but the reality is they don't actually practice most of those things. The left claims to be for gay rights, but leftist regimes were quite homophobic, and they're allied with Islamic partners who kill gay people and who, of course, are not very feminist. So some of these women do not actually want feminism, even as they claim to be feminists. Instead, they say one thing, they mean something very different. This kind of society that Linda Sarsour wants is not a feminist society. I mean, if you look at her in the hijab and in the various Islamic groups that she's allied with, those don't represent a feminist universe. If she were a feminist, she probably would not be any kind of traditional Muslim.
Just so shameless, shameful, embarrassing. Before we conclude our episode this evening, you wrote about this in your article and in your blogs. The way that you get to watch a movie is you pay for admission to get into the movie. The way that Starbucks wants to ingratiate itself with the left, the admission it pays has to be Jew hatred, correct?
Exactly. You have to pay subservience to the left's ideas and to the left's hatred. It's not enough to believe the positive thing that the left believes. You have to believe the negative things. You have to hate the same people.
And so Starbucks in the end has chosen anti-Semitism.
It has indeed, and I suspect the ADL will have to end up choosing it too.
The ADL, which is supposed to be really looking out for the rights and civil rights and the defense of Jews, embraces anti-Semitism.
Increasingly, there's no room for Jews on the left. This is something we learn from history. It's something we can see in current events in Europe, for example, the situation of the Labour Party. In the UK, there is not going to be any room for Jews on the left as the left becomes more radical. Instead, you'll be divided between those who participate, who cooperate, who collaborate with the left in its anti-Semitic agenda, and those who resist it.
So what would you conclude about Starbucks in one or two sentences in terms of this whole issue?
Well, this whole issue began with Starbucks claiming that they want to fight racism, but they're fighting racism by colluding with anti-Semitism. It's not actual bigotry that bothers them. It's appearing unfashionable.
Right. Daniel, before we go, what should the viewers of the Glazov Gang be thinking about in the next few days and weeks?
Well, as always, there is the ruthless campaign against President Trump by the shadow government of the Democrats. And meanwhile, there are profound events occurring around the world. President Trump's poll numbers have been rising. Millennials are actually looking around. They're seeing economic improvements. They're seeing that tax reform has benefited them. The left has bet everything on winning the midterms. And so they're going to redouble their campaign. They're going to do everything possible to bring down this country.
Scary stuff. I did a moment this week on Michelle Wolf and her attack on Sanders, Sarah Sanders, and I mentioned your blog where you said that, you know, it's just reduced to hatred now what the left is doing. Daniel, in my moment, I said that the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, is reduced now. It's synthesized in 90 seconds of just watching Michelle Wolf. This is really what the leftist idea is all about. Just 30 seconds from you on what that hatred of Michelle Wolf says about the left.
I could also quote, you could see the 2-minute hate scene in Orwell's 1984 and the central idea of power existing for the sake of power, of imagine a boot stamping forever on the human face. This is what the left is. It's about power. It's about degrading, oppressing, and destroying other people. It's about stomping on them over and over again. The left claims that it wants utopia, that it wants a better world, but every time it turns into gulags, it turns into mass murder, it turns into heaps and mountains of corpses. And there's a reason that it happens that way. The reason is that the left is built on hate, that what its people really want is not a better world. They want to be able to destroy the people they hate. They want to be able to grind their enemies under.
All in the name of humanitarianism and social justice. Daniel Greenfield and Daniel Greenfield's hat. Thank you for joining the Glazov Gang.
Very much my pleasure.
Fascinating episode. Thank you, Daniel, for who you are and for everything that you do. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the Glazov Gang this evening. Please remember, we're a fan-generated program. We're here because of you. If you like and appreciate what we do, please go to jamieglazov.com to support the show. And make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel of this show, The Glazov Gang. We'll see you soon. Good night.